Well, as most of the attendees know, my name is Mara DeCola. For anyone who doesn't know me, I am the Executive Director for Cooperating Raleigh Colleges, the consortium of colleges here in Raleigh. One of my favorite aspects of my job is that we offer these free professional development events throughout the academic year. And so I'm super grateful to have Tamika Singleton here to MC this event today. Tamika is a corporate trainer for Wake Tech Community College, and she is going to MC the event for you today. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tamika to do some introductions and some just quick instructions for today's webinar, and I'll let her take over.
All right. Thank you, Mara. Thank you. So excited to be here amongst so many different folks from various community colleges, or various colleges for that much. So as Mara mentioned, I am from Wake Technical Community College, and I'm so happy to see everyone here. We have the fabulous Dr. Jerry Nussel, who's going to be our speaker for today. He is a psychologist, educator, and certified ombudsman with nearly 35 years in mental health and higher education. He has served as both a senior clinician in New York City's largest private outpatient facility and as an executive leader in student services nationwide. Certified in the mindfulness program, Search Inside Yourself, Dr. Nussel brings a compassionate approach for fostering personal growth and well-being. A New York native, he's also completed 12 marathons and holds a third-degree Black belt in Taekwondo. So I'm excited to welcome everyone to this fabulous session. We're going to be talking about navigating conflict, an introduction to strategies for understanding resolutions. We will have an opportunity, or you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions halfway through our session and towards the end. Please feel free to use our chat session as well as our Q&A area. And if you want to turn your attention to the bottom of your toolbar, you'll see the Q&A function there as well as the chat function. So please feel free to use that during the time that we are asking for your questions. And so without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Dr. Jerry Nussel.
Thank you so much, Tamika. I appreciate the kind introduction. And thank you, Mara, for inviting me here. And thank you all for sharing your time with me on a very busy, full day. I'm really excited to be spending this time with you and trust that during this next hour and a half, we'll have some interesting and hopefully fulfilling work that we'll be doing surrounding the topic of conflict in the workplace. But before we get started, since I know it has been a very full and eventful day for so many of us, I thought that we'd take just a minute to arrive together. A lot of times when we arrive at meetings, either individually or in groups such as this one, our bodies are physically in one place, but our minds are off someplace entirely different. And so to help us prepare for this webinar today, I thought it'd be helpful for us to take a moment to engage in a very quick practice so that our minds and our bodies can be in that same place at the same time. Okay, so let's just go through this together. What I'd ask you to do is, if you're seated, find a way to sit where you can feel both upright and alert, but also in a way that invites just a little bit of ease into the body. And so if you're seated, what you might want to do is, instead of leaning against your chair back, you might want to scoot a little bit further forward in your chair and arch your back just slightly. And you could rest your feet flat on the floor and place your hands on your lap or your legs, wherever they're most comfortable. Find a posture that works for you. And take a nice full breath in. A nice long breath out. And find your own natural rhythm of breathing. And as you do so, let your chin gently, slowly drop down towards your chest. And you could either close your eyes or keep them cast downward on the floor in a nice soft gaze in front of you. And take another nice full breath in and out. And as you breathe, see if you can find the place in your body where you feel the breath most vividly right now. So for some of you, that might be in the chest, or it might be in the belly, or it might be air passing at the tip of the nose by the nostrils. Wherever it is, allow your attention to fully and gently rest in that place and let it serve as an anchor point for the next minute or so. In a short while, you might notice that your mind starts to wander, and that's okay. You might notice thoughts or sensations or even emotions start to arise. And that's all very normal. When you notice that your attention's been pulled away from your anchor point, very gently bring it back to that anchor point and let it rest there. With just the right amount of effort. And if it's helpful, you might say to yourself, breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in. And breathing out, I know that I'm breathing out. See what it's like to follow your next in-breath all the way in until that slight pause where your out-breath starts, following that all the way to its conclusion. Noticing that next slight pause before you start your in-breath. And see if you can follow one full cycle of breath on your own. And there's nothing to do and no place to go, just following your breath. And now seeing what it's like in this moment to follow 3 full cycles of breath, from in-breath all the way through out-breath. Good. And then when you're ready, you're going to very gently take another 2 or 3 full breaths, and then very slowly you can open your eyes and come to this shared virtual space together. Okay, great. So thank you for joining on such a busy day. I'd imagine there are a lot of different things that you have going on in your life right now. And I appreciate you taking the time to be here for talking about conflict resolution. Now, this is an introductory webinar on strategies for understanding and building skills to help work towards resolution of conflict. But there are literally entire courses that are offered, full courses, 16-week courses that cover this topic. So this is not meant to be a solution to all the different types of problems that you might encounter with regard to conflict, but hopefully you'll find some productive tools that you can take away with you and you could start utilizing them right away. The hope is to have these be as accessible as possible so that you could use them both in your professional life, but also you might find application in your personal life as well. So just a little snapshot of what we're going to be covering today. We'll talk about defining conflict. So if we're going to talk about conflict, it's important that we kind of rest on an agreed upon definition. We'll build our understanding of conflict by looking at it through 2 different lenses. One is through the lens of social psychology, and the other is through the lens of basic physiology. We'll talk about conflict in its productive and less productive forms, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about some pitfalls that you might want to involve, some common things that keep people tangled up in conflict, maybe make it hard for them to enter into productive dialogue, or make it difficult just to kind of work with it or approach it at all. And then we'll leave time at the end for questions, comments. We'd love to hear your experiences and things that are coming alive for you right now with regard to conflict resolution. So to start with, I'd like you to just kind of quietly note to yourself some metaphors for conflict. So if you had to finish this stem, this very basic stem with a word or 2, conflict is, what word or words might come to mind? And I encourage you not to think of what you might believe are the right words or the right things to think of, so to speak, with conflict, but what most naturally comes to mind when I say conflict is. And since this is a webinar, I won't be able to see your thoughts on this, but oftentimes when people think about conflict and they finish the stem, the words that come to mind are similar to the ones that you see on this slide. That conflict is messy, it's a war, it's an inferno, it's a disaster, right? It's something that's really not very pleasant. And because it's not pleasant, it comes coupled with the sense that, conflict means there's something wrong. Perhaps it means there's something wrong with me and or with the other person. But if or when possible, it's best to try to steer clear of conflict because it is messy. And a lot of times it comes attached with these very emotionally charged, it becomes this very emotionally charged experience for others that can be very uncomfortable. And I think that can be very true, certainly in its unproductive sense. Conflict can be messy and laden with all these different, high emotions and make it hard to feel like we're able to work productively with it to get through it. But the possibility exists for us to engage with conflict in a different way. And when we try to work with conflict in a way that becomes less scary or less overwhelming, we might see conflict as more of an opportunity for us to learn from each other. So we look at it as a lesson or a dance or a non-violent game, so a non-contact game together. And if we can try to approach it in that way, we begin to realize that conflict happens. When there are people present, there's always going to be the possibility for conflict. And we'll talk obviously a lot more about that as we go through our time together. At its best, conflict gives us a chance to try to learn from each other and to try to build understanding and maybe to move things forward in a more productive direction. So opportunities for growth, bringing problems to light, maybe even helping us forge different kinds of relationships with each other. When we talk about conflict, there are certainly many different ways to define it. When we talk about conflict for our purposes during this time together, we're thinking of it in the workplace in particular. And as such, we're looking at it as an experience that involves at least two interdependent individuals. And so you see interdependent on this slide, and it's very critical. This is different, for example, from the type of conflict that we might get into when we're in the parking lot at Target or when we're driving on the road. That's not what this is for, although there might be some things that you could take away from here to apply to those situations as well. In the conflict for our purposes, we're talking about that interdependence. So this is somebody that you are going to be engaged with. You really can't just simply necessarily avoid each other. There's got to be some kind of thing that brings you together. And as such, when you're brought together, the things that lead to conflict or that contribute to conflict are on this slide that are highlighted in this kind of palish yellow. We perceive that there are incompatible goals, scarce resources, and or interference from others in achieving our own goals. Now, as we go through these next slides, I will at times be pulling parts of this definition forward and putting them on the bottom of the slide so that you can kind of keep them in mind. But just something at the outset for you to reflect on. Now, I think we all know why we're here, because conflict is, again, very prevalent, and it could be very detrimental to the work that we're trying to do with each other, for each other in some cases, and as we're trying to serve the people around us. Conflict is a very real thing. We're not always very well equipped, or we don't think we're very well equipped to handle it. As you see from this slide here, there is a stat that almost half of emerging leaders report that they have difficulty managing conflict in the workplace, that not a lot of people feel they're very proficient. They don't have the skill set, the experience, the background, the wherewithal to successfully navigate conflict. And a lot of managers even struggle with saying to the folks who work for them, with them, like, these are the kind of tools that you might use if you're having a hard time with conflict. So again, I don't think this is coming as a surprise to anyone. Conflict is prevalent and conflict is messy. And what I hope to do is to offer you some thoughts, some food for thought on how you might more productively engage with it. So if we're going to talk about conflict and what we do with it, it helps to get an understanding of where it might come from. And I say might because it's a complex issue and there are a multitude of areas it can come from. But from the lens of social psychology, one area we're going to settle on is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you may be familiar with Maslow. Essentially, we're going to focus on the three levels that are highlighted. So we're not going to worry about the physiological or the self-actualization levels, but we're going to reflect a little bit on those levels of safety and security, social belonging, and esteem. So one at a time. Safety and security, of course, can mean our physical safety and well-being, but in the world that we live in today, it can also mean the societal sense of safety and well-being that we have, that sense that we are safe in our jobs, we're financially secure, that we are held in high esteem by others, A sense of social belonging is very important to us also. So we are very much social beings. We may not necessarily need to or want to be around others for the entirety of our day, but we are social beings, and that sense of knowing that we are accepted and we have a closeness with other individuals is very important to us as social beings. And esteem is very important to us also. So we want to be seen by others as competent. We want to have some autonomy. We want to be respected and appreciated. And we also need those things to kind of shine through in our view of ourselves. So some things just to start building our understanding of conflict, hold those in your thoughts. We're also going to look at something called self-determination theory. So more human needs the need for autonomy. We need to feel like we have control over our daily lives, that we get to make decisions for ourselves. Relatedness is very important to us. So this maps a little bit onto what I shared on the previous slide with social belonging. Autonomy, by the way, might map a little bit onto esteem from the previous slide, as does competence, the idea that we have this mastery over our environment, that we are good at what we do, right? And in the workplace, these are all potentially hot buttons as we interact with each other. You might look at this set of social psychology needs as kind of the roadmap to, or the user manual, so to speak, of us as human beings. We have sore spots. Not all of us have these needs, all of us 100% of the time, but they are needs that do exist for us as human beings by and large. And when these needs get threatened or pushed on, they're really fertile ground for conflict to start to emerge. So moving forward just a little bit, other needs that we have through the lens of social psychology. We want to appear and be likable. And you might say to yourself, well, I could see the connection to that and relatedness, social belonging. We want to convey status and power. You might see a connection between that and things like autonomy and competency. So with status and power, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have those things over other individuals, but that at the very least, we don't want to be seen or we don't want to feel that we are less than someone else, right? We don't want to be talked down to. We don't want to be communicated to in a way that feels disrespectful, those sorts of things. We want to be treated fairly. That's pretty self-explanatory. And in a similar way, we want to feel that we have certainty over our environments. We typically don't respond very well when we're dealing with uncertainty or ambiguity. It stresses us out. It makes us more tense. And so when all these things combined, this is, again, the time. These are places where conflict is very ripe to emerge. Let's set aside social psychology for just a moment. And as we build our understanding, we're going to focus a bit on the physiology of conflict. And so there are a couple of regions of the brain that I'd like to share with you. One is the salience network. Now, the salience network is the part of the brain that includes the limbic system, which includes the amygdala. And this is the part of the brain that, among other things, is responsible for our fight-flight response. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, this has served us very well. If we were walking through the woods and we had a bear start charge at us, our body would automatically spring into action, right? We don't have to think about it. Our pupils would dilate, our heart would start to speed up, we'd start to breathe faster, our palms would start to sweat, right? All of these things would happen with our sympathetic nervous system, and that would mobilize us so that we can just react immediately and get ourselves to safety. Okay, so that has served us very well by and large from an evolutionary standpoint. Set that aside for a moment, and the other region of the brain that we're going to talk about is the central executive network. So this is the network that resides in our prefrontal cortex right here behind our forehead. And this is the part of the brain that, among other things, is responsible for all of our good higher order thinking. So decision-making, creativity, problem solving, those sorts of things. Now, ordinarily, when we are not stressed out at this entire level, or we don't feel a sense of threat at a high level, these two parts of the brain very effectively communicate with each other. So the central executive network in some ways can check the work of the salience network. So for example, if I stumble into my kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning and I go turn on the light and I'm getting set to make myself a cup of tea, and out of the corner of my eye, I see something on the counter and I might start and think it's a mouse. And so the limbic system, starts to become activated. But then because it's not a high stress or high threat situation for me, Very shortly thereafter, the Central Executive Network kind of jumps online and says, Jerry, relax, it's not a mouse, it's just an avocado. Catch your breath, just, it's okay, right? And so if it's not a high stress or high threat situation for me, things can kind of come back online fairly quickly. However, when we are under high stress, when we are feeling threat at a higher level, right, the activation is primarily in the salience network, right? And we are wired to protect, right, to defend ourselves, to get ourselves to safety. But because there's this heightened activation in the salience network, there's lower activation in this central executive network. And this is why you may have had the experience when you're under high amount of stress, when you're engaged in conflict, for example, it's sometimes hard to think straight. And that is because, again, just by basic physiology, the part of the brain that is more active is that protect and defend part of the brain, and the part that's less active is that part that's able to rationally think things through, right? Now, I've used the example that the high threat situation, the high stress situation might be something that is related to our physical safety, such as a bear charging at us, in the woods. But this relates to other things in our world that are not necessarily always physical, but are social in nature. So you might reflect on the slide, or excuse me, some of the slides that I shared with you earlier, that those social threats can be things like, losing face in a meeting, somebody offering you critical feedback. It could be, an email that you get from your supervisor saying, I'd like to see you in my office in the next 5 minutes, right? The things that threaten maybe our sense of employment, if we feel like we're going to, have our job and our livelihood and our finances at risk, those things can create high stress and high strain. And then, of course, while this is not the focal point of today's webinar, I would even say, obviously, the political situation that we're in can create that sense of heightened anxiety and stress and strain in individuals. And when that threat level goes up, the activation is in that salience network, and there's less activation in the central executive network, and it does make it harder to think things through. And it's very much a more emotionally charged, very stressful experience for us. So just some thoughts there to share with you, because if we're going to talk about how we productively work with conflict, it's important to have a sense of some of the areas from which it might arise. Okay. So with that said, I have shared a couple of times that there are more and less productive ways of engaging with conflict. When we're at our worst in engaging with conflict, or I should say maybe at our less productive, here's some of what that feels like and kind of how it manifests itself when we're in the middle of it. Things start to feel personal and perception is skewed, right? That threat response takes over, emotions take over, and as a result, oftentimes communication breaks down. This is all part of that threat response that I just described with the basic physiology slide a moment ago, right? When we're feeling like we're under attack, when we're feeling like we're not looking forward to a conversation, we're caught off guard, or suddenly things become emotionally heated, things do feel personal, communication does break down. In addition, our field of vision narrows, right? And when that happens, it's hard sometimes to think of any paths forward. It's hard to develop any options. It's hard to see anything other than maybe the way that we're locked in on. We get sometimes this tunnel vision, as does maybe the other party. And because this is very emotionally charged, we have at least one party, perhaps more than one party, who's in the space where there's not a whole lot of productive work that's going on. There's not a whole lot of problem solving or decision making or rational thought, right, that's going on. There's just a lot of emotional heat and energy that we get wrapped up in, that we get tangled up in, that we get stuck in. And we also get stuck in our positions, right? And at the most basic level, positions are, kind of yes, no, for, against statements. So I am for something, I am against something. And when we engage in conflict with each other, we often get stuck at this level of positions, right? What we want or what we don't want, right? And if at all possible, it's important to dig a little bit deeper and see what underlies the position, right? So I'll say a little bit more about this later, of course. But, if we can get beyond just the simple for, against, yes, no, and move to interests, and then that's usually undergirded by things like values and needs and beliefs, if we can build that sort of understanding, it definitely changes the experience. So with destructive conflict, you might take a moment to look at the bottom of the slide and see how you think some of those hot button areas for us as human beings right? Social belonging, relatedness, likability, safety, esteem, competence, fairness, autonomy, how they connect with the kinds of things that lead to this more destructive version of conflict. And I'll go back a slide just so you can look at that as well, right? Social belonging, relatedness, fairness, right? When we feel like someone is coming at us, that they're not understanding us, that there's a sense of threat from the social and from the physiological standpoints, it makes it really challenging for us to work with these things, right? To dialogue with each other, to problem solve. Some common culprits when it comes to conflict in the workplace. Again, there are so many reasons why it can spring up, but here are 4 different categories that I'd like to share with you. The first is relationship conflict, right? Now, unless you are fortunate enough to select your entire team, and even if you are a person who selected your entire team, you'll know that by and large, when we're with each other in the workplace, we're kind of together with each other and we're forced to get along. There's not necessarily a goodness of fit when it comes to things like personality and style, matters of taste. There are just so many different things that make us who we are, right? And those things may sometimes feel more or less compatible with each other. Well, in addition to that, then we have the layer of values conflict. And clearly this is something I think that will resonate with so much of us, especially today, right? The big 3 being politics and religion and social issues. We just have these fundamental differences when it comes to our values and maybe our identities, and that can often result in conflict springing up among colleagues, supervisors, supervisees, and obviously with people in our personal lives as well. Task conflict is a big one. As an ombuds, I often hear of situations where a supervisor or a supervisee might come forward and say that they have thoughts on how they're able to, to take care of the things that they believe they're charged with taking care of, how they meet their responsibilities. Now, if you reflect back on some of those earlier slides, you might say to yourself, this sounds a lot like it could push on things like status and power, right? And autonomy and competence, right? A lot of these things I would encourage you just to reflect back on those potential sore spots for us as human beings and see how those things might contribute to these kind of difficulties that I'm sharing with you right now. But with task conflict, it's this disagreement. This is where I hear about people saying they feel like they're being micromanaged, they're being bossed around. The quality or the quantity of the work is something that people disagree on. So the how to get things done, who is supposed to do what, the goals that we have, and then sometimes even the divvying up of the scarce resources that are available can all come to play when it comes to task-related conflict. And then another big one, of course, is communication. So both in terms of how we are communicated with and how we're communicating with others. And this encompasses the entirety of not just the spoken word, but the nonverbals and more, right? So it's speaking, it's not just the content, but it's how we're spoken to and the choice of words, that nonverbal, and then the listening part of it, right? And so it's not just that it's the speaking part, but the listening part is somebody deeply and genuinely listening to us. And then in turn, are we able to offer the gift of our full attention to other individuals so that they can feel heard and seen and understood when we're having disagreements that crop up regarding or surrounding any of these different things that I've mentioned over the previous slides, right? So listening and speaking, critical. So that's the background, just a brief background as we consider this as an introduction, right? A brief snapshot of some of the things that can contribute to the emergence of conflict in the workplace, right? We've talked about some different categories, we've talked about physiology, and we've talked about just the psychology, some of the psychology of us as human beings, right? So then what do we do about all this? Well, we can use this to our advantage, of course. We can use this information so that we can move away from simply kind of trying to muddle through to being more strategic about how we engage with this. Now, I'm going to give you a snapshot at the start because rather than just kind of walk you through step by step, I'd like you to have that kind of 10,000 foot view so you can get an idea of how all the pieces might fit together. And then we're going to break them out and actually talk about the pieces individually. So this nutshell version goes something like this. Because there is that heightened sense of energy, because there is the physiology of becoming activated in response to threat and stress that is often part of a conflict experience, one of the first things that we're going to do is settle ourselves down. We're also going to check in with ourselves to see not just where we're at, but what our intentions and goals are in trying to work with conflict, right? And this is a very important step to take that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. So the first three steps are really about kind of just doing a deep check-in with ourselves. More on that in a bit. After we do that check-in, after we reflect, then it's time to actually start digging in with the other party or parties, right? To get together, to get started, to introduce the issue, to listen and to share, right? In that order, if at all possible. To keep a dialogue going so that we can engage in problem solving. Now you might notice already that problem solving comes all the way at the end. And in some ways, this probably doesn't come as a huge surprise. And in other ways, it might seem a little unfamiliar because when we're in conflict with each other, when we're in disagreement, when there are these high stress situations, a lot of times, some of us, many of us might be interested in trying to zip right ahead and just trying to figure this out and get through it. But there are a lot of things that could happen before then that might make this a different kind of experience. So there's your snapshot, right? And then let's break it out and let's talk about this a little bit at a time. If you have questions or comments or concerns or disagreements, I'm completely fine with that. I welcome all of that. Because it's a webinar, you may enter these in the, goodness me, what are we calling it? It's not the chat, the Q&A. There it is.
Yeah.
You can enter those in the Q&A. Tamika, you're almost able to jump in and help me out with that. So thank you for stepping in.
Absolutely. So as Dr. Nussel said, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please utilize either the chat feature or the Q&A session. It's my understanding that some of you may not have access to the chat function, and that could simply be maybe due to your settings or the version in which you're using.
Okay, great.
We
And
do
we'll try
have
to keep an
Q&A.
eye on those things. Yeah, thank you, Tamika.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll try to keep an eye on those things, but I think in greater likelihood, we'll probably spend some time towards the end of this webinar and circling back to dialogue about those things. But in the meantime, I'd say either enter them in or leave yourself a note, whatever feels right to you, and we'll go forward from here. Okay, so you have your nutshell version. Let's talk about the settle down part. In my mind, and this is my perspective on this, in my mind, and through my experience, both as a mental health professional and as an ombuds, I have somewhere in the neighborhood of, goodness me, conservatively between 40,000 and 60,000 hours that I've spent dialoguing with individuals about the challenges that they're experiencing. So this is where that comes from, in addition to my own education. And I think there's a lot of good literature out there that supports this, but I offer this to you in humility. The settle down part is important for so many reasons, including the basic physiology of how we work when we're feeling threatened. We want to stay in the thinking part of our brain as much as possible. And you'll probably hear me say this a number more times as we go through this webinar together, but staying in the thinking part of the brain essentially means moving away from just getting stuck in the salience network, that protect, fight, flight, defend part of the brain, and instead trying to keep the central executive network online as best as possible, right? Because we are going to eventually need to dialogue. We are going to try to do something. But it's going to be hard to do those things if all the alarm bells are going off and where our attention is being focused is on protecting ourselves. So in the moment, catch your breath. This is probably one of those things that we all learned, the count to 10 rule when you were in, elementary school, count to 10, catch your breath. It sounds very basic. It is very basic. I'd put it in the category of simple, but not always easy to do. And yet we can do it. And we have some strategies that we can use to wheel out in the moment that could be really effective. Some refer to this catching of the breath as the sacred pause. If nothing else, just take that breath and try to settle yourself down. Now, there are different techniques that I'm going to offer you that are what are called micro practices, right? So they're just things that you can bring out in the moment. One of them to help you catch your breath is a 4 square breathing technique. Some of you may be familiar with this. Oftentimes, individuals who work in EMS or just some kind of emergency response services will rely on this strategy, and they rely on it because it's simple and it's effective, right? It works. And the 4 square breathing practice goes like this. You're going to breathe in over the count of 4. You're going to hold it for a 4 count, right? I guess I should move over in the square. So you're going to breathe in for a 4 count. You're going to hold it for a 4 count. You're going to exhale over a 4 count, and you're going to hold that for a 4 count. So it would go something like breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, and continue. Now this helps bring online or activate, I should say, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our central nervous system that comes online to help settle us down after we've been activated or as we've started to become activated. So sympathetic nervous system results in those things I described earlier, with the pupils dilating and the heart speeding up and our breathing getting more rapid. And the parasympathetic, this deep breathing, is shown to invite more of this settling, relaxing state that we really need to be in to keep us in that thinking part of the brain. Another practice you can use is a 3-breath practice, right? And it is what it sounds like. It's the process of taking 3 breaths and intentionally, on the first breath, settling the mind. On the third breath, relaxing the body. And on the third breath, checking in, asking yourself the question, what's most important to me right now? Now, that question is designed to get us in the here and now, because a lot of times when we're stressed out, or actually not even just when we're stressed out, naturally as human beings, our minds wander. There was a study, in the Harvard Business Review that said that almost 50% of the time, 49% of the time, our minds are wandering off someplace other than where we are at a given moment. But certainly when we're under stress, we tend to either go back in time to ruminate about something, or we zip ahead in time to worry about something instead of staying in the here and now. And the here and now is where the work gets done. So that third breath, what's most important right now, serves to bring us back to, what do I need at this particular moment, right? So short term, these are some strategies that you could use just to catch your breath to help your body start to settle down. So if you find yourself in a situation that starts to get heated, consider this as your sacred pause, as this catching of the breath, right? But more long term, a recommendation is, if you haven't done so already, to consider starting some kind of mental training program for yourself. So in our culture, I think we're a lot more familiar and comfortable with taking care of our physical selves. So I suspect that if we were in physical space together and ask for a show of hands, how many people have some way of taking care of their physical selves? I would imagine most people would probably raise their hand, where you might go for a walk or go for a run, or you might take a physical fitness class or lift weights, or just to engage in some kind of form of physical self-care. Again, I think we're a lot more comfortable and familiar with that sort of thing. But I suspect that in our culture, we're probably not quite as consistent with taking care of our mental and emotional selves. And some kind of meditation practice can be extremely helpful in supporting you as you start to, build your toolbox, or expand your toolbox when it comes to self-care. So one form of meditation is mindfulness, and a definition of mindfulness at its most basic is just being aware. A broader definition is being aware of what's happening in your mind and in your body and in your physical environment, with a sense of curiosity and kindness. It's really designed as a tool to help bring yourself into the present moment, right? Now, that arrival practice that I offer all the way at the outset can be one form of a mindfulness practice. You're just learning to follow the breath. And there's not necessarily anything magical about following the breath in particular, again, although there's the deep breathing aspect of it that settles us down a little bit. But the following of the breath is meant to give us some anchor point where we can rest our attention. If you think of our minds as being a snow globe, when we're under stress or threat, that snow globe gets shaken up, right? And there's this swirl of activity that's taking place, right? If you were to take that snow globe and set it on something stable, over time, the snow would start to settle and we'd be able to get more clarity into what's going on there. The stability in this metaphor is resting things on the stability of the breath, just following the breath. You can use your feet, you can use sound, you could use any number of different things. But traditionally, with these kind of practices, one might follow the breath. Now, there are resources that you can use, such as apps like, Insight Timer or Headspace or Calm. You can find YouTube videos, you can find books. There are a whole host of resources that are available to you. I would say, just like with physical training, if you wanted to build your physical stamina up, you wouldn't necessarily just roll out of bed and try to run a 5K. You'd build up to it over time. So when the time comes for you to run longer distances, you have that available to you. Well, the same thing applies to cultivating this capacity to settle yourself down, to engage in this mental training, so that when you do need it, it's more readily available to you. It's more of a habit for you, right? It's more accessible. And so for the long term, having some kind of mindfulness or meditation practice can start to build that capacity so that when you do need it, for example, in conflict situations, it's there for you. Now, I'll say again, I personally think that this is probably one of the most important steps for any number of reasons that you can take if you're going to try to enter into a productive engagement with conflict. Okay, so a lot on settling down. Self-awareness is also key. Once we settle down, it's important to check in with ourselves. And we're going to check in with ourselves at two different levels. We're checking in with ourselves at the level of the body and at the level of the mind. At the level of the body, you're going to try to check in and see what might be going on for yourself. The body gives us clues to what's going on for ourselves emotionally, right? We're given these kind of little hints of what's going on for ourselves if only we would stop and pay attention to see what's going on. So for example, if I'm having a conversation with somebody and somebody says something to me that, might be something that I disagree with, I might first notice that in my body. Oh my goodness, my heart rate just sped up. I could just feel that. I just caught my breath. I could feel myself start to perspire a little bit. I could start to feel my face start to heat up, right? I could feel my brow start to furrow or my jaw start to clench, right? These are all subtle cues, or maybe not so subtle cues, that the body is giving us to say, something just landed for you. Maybe it's worth looking into to see what's going on for you right now. Rather than just react to that in the moment, we're going to stop and check in with ourselves and say, interesting, right? I often start this with interesting. Interesting, what's going on there? Something just happened there because I'm starting to feel this buzz of activity in my mind, or I'm starting to feel, again, these different physiological sensations that are showing up in the body. So what has set me off? What may have activated me? Let me maybe go now to the mind and see what thoughts are present right now. What feels threatened for me? And you can use that list of potential suspects, so to speak, that I shared earlier when it comes to the psychology of us as human beings, all those different needs: autonomy, relatedness, fairness, competence, right? Social belonging, all of those different things. You might start with those and say, interesting. I wonder if one of those is being touched on. A model that I didn't share earlier on the slides, but one that I'll often check in with as just a really quick one for myself, is the SCARF model. So it's an acronym: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. I'll go through that checklist and see, is anything landing with me? What feels threatened right now? What thoughts are present? Now, it's going to be a lot harder to access those things if all the alarm bells are going off and the salience network is very highly activated. So that's why, again, first step, settle yourself down so you can get that clarity as your snow globe has been shaken, right? And you can check in with yourself and say, what might be going on for myself? I mentioned just a moment ago, the idea is to move away from just simply reacting and moving towards responding. So we're moving away from compulsion and we're moving toward choice. There's this absolutely fantastic quote that I regret I didn't put it on this slide, but some of you may be familiar with it. It's a quote that comes from Viktor Frankl, who is a Holocaust survivor. He's a psychologist. He's the founder of logotherapy. And his quote, or the quote that's often attributed to him, is that in between stimulus and response, there is a space. Right? In that space lies the power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So if we're going to make use of that small space between stimulus and response, it helps to be aware of what's going on in the moment. So not disengaged, not running on autopilot, really checking in with ourselves and seeing, interesting, what might be happening to me right now? What has got my attention, right? So that's going to allow us then to, instead of just impulsively defaulting to our habitual ways of reacting or responding, right? Reacting, use that space to check in, give us maybe a little bit more space, and then think about how we might more thoughtfully respond to a situation when we're engaged in conflict or just in difficult conversation or any kind of dialogue. We'll want to also be very intentional about how you show up. Now, when we talk about being intentional about how we show up, we'll cover that more in another slide. So actually, I'll save that for just a moment. But maybe more, what is your goal in your communication or interaction with somebody? If you're engaged in conflict and you're thinking about dialoguing with somebody or engaging with somebody around this conflict, a very important starting point after you settle down is to check in with yourself and ask, what exactly do you want to get out of this communication? What are your hopes, right? So again, oftentimes, as in my role as ombuds, somebody will come to me with a concern, and as they processed it and shared their thoughts and experiences around it, a real starting point is, what would you like to see happen, right? Like what would be a productive outcome, and what would be a productive possibility? What would you like to see happen, right? And sometimes when I ask that question, the response is maybe a little less productive, right? The intention, if you were, if a person was being very honest with themselves, they might say, honestly, I just want to give the other person a piece of my mind. I just want to make them feel the discomfort or the frustration or the strong emotions that I'm feeling. I just want to share that with somebody else, give them a good kick in the shins. That's a very real experience, right? I think we can all probably relate to having been there. But if at all possible, checking in with that intention, we might say to ourselves, I want this to be better than what it is right now. And then you can start to fill in the blanks of what better looks like. What is a more productive, well, better way of moving things forward, right? Because once you identify that, what your hope for the interaction is going to be, then everything that you say and do should really flow in support of that goal, right? And that makes it easier for us to kind of weed out some of the less productive things that we might be tempted to, or by habit, by a reactive, mode, be more inclined to kind of bring into an interaction, right? So you'd ask yourself, like, what am I trying to accomplish here? If I want to work towards moving this conflict in a better direction, is this thought, is this word, is this action going to really be in support of that? Can I find another way of saying that? Is that really something that the person's going to be able to receive and work with? Because it is a partnership. You can do your part, but it's very much a partnership trying to work through conflict resolution, right? Or work towards that. Okay, so checking in with yourself is very important, and self-management is very important. How do you show up, right? You've clarified your intention, and you see here that I've underlined some words here. Be genuine and wanting to listen and learn, right? So the genuine part is very important. It's not a checklist kind of process where it's like, okay, go ahead and tell me what's on your mind, and I'm going to sit here with my arms crossed, or I'm going to go through the motions of doing this. You have to kind of really tap into that place, that part of your being that is very genuinely curious and wanting to listen and to learn. For conflict resolution to be more productive, it's important to build that level of understanding. It doesn't mean you necessarily are going to agree with the other person or like what the other person has to say, or vice versa, but there has to be that level of curiosity and interest in trying to understand the other person to the best of your ability. And it has to be genuine. If the other person is not picking up on the sincerity of that, it's probably going to be something that becomes more of a tug of war than it is something that's going to be meaningful, right? So listening and learning going to be extremely important. With that in mind, there's some basic things that we already know, right? When we're trying to engage with individuals and to keep them in the thinking part of their brain as much as we're trying to keep, over here, as much as we're trying to keep ourselves in the thinking part of our brain, right? And that's being respectful and professional and patient, right? So we're setting the tone, and there's no guarantee that the other person's going to respond in turn, right? We can enter into a conversation with a lot of calmness and good intention. And because it's a partnership, because it takes more than one party, there's no guarantee that the other person is going to respond in turn, but you can only do your part. You can hold up your side of the equation, and it increases the likelihood of this being a better experience, but it isn't by no means a guarantee. So to that end, being respectful in both in tone, right, in choice of words, in the nonverbals that we're showing to each other, right, all of those things are going to be incredibly important. Another thing is to tap into empathy. And this sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, right? In an interaction with someone with whom we're engaged in conflict, we're probably not having the warmest fuzzy feelings. And our natural, our first inclination is not going to say, let me understand the other person, let me extend empathy to them. Quite the opposite, we're sometimes going to feel like this person is a major thorn in my side. This is unpleasant. I may not even like the other person. There's some stress, strain, tension there, right? But if at all possible, tapping into empathy and that sense of common humanity, right, can be very powerful ways to set the tone. And that is going to be something that possibly makes us more receptive to the other person and makes the other person more receptive to us. It doesn't mean glossing over differences, but it just means tapping into that sense of common humanity to help support empathy Empathy is, kindness is the engine of empathy. We're trying to just get into that headspace because that's what you need, right? That's what you need to keep in this part of the brain and not in the, well, I'm here to fight part of the brain. Okay, and then you may have heard this already also. Sometimes we may have strong feelings about the person, and that starts to set us off. And if at all possible, it can be very helpful to separate the person from the problem, right? My feelings about a person can be very different about the feelings about the issue itself. So identifying the issue, identifying what better looks like, this ties into some of the things I shared earlier. That's something to keep in mind. Entering into a dialogue. Okay, so you've checked in with yourself, you've settled yourself down, you've checked in with yourself, you're showing up in a way that is, designed to be more engaging. What do we do now? Well, keep in mind that you're equal partners. This isn't a hierarchy, right? That gets into pressing on the buttons of status and power that I shared earlier. Stay in the present and look to the future, right? I mentioned earlier that as individuals, as human beings, we are very adept at time travel. We go back to the past to ruminate. And, going back to the past to learn and reflect can be very helpful. But a lot of times we go back to the past to ruminate. We also zip ahead to the future. Now, a lot of times it could be very helpful to move ahead to the future for planning purposes. But what we wind up doing is moving ahead to the future to worry, right? Now, with conflict, there is going to be oftentimes an accumulated history, right? And so it's okay to have some examples ready of things that have transpired, because if we talk about things in too high level of fashion, it's too broad, too general, it's sometimes hard to work with that in a meaningful way. So it's good to have some examples at the ready, but I would encourage you not to enter into the conversation with a laundry list of, here are the 20 things that I have that are grievances. On January 5th, you said this. On January 10th, you said this. On February 18th, you said this, and so on, right? Because that just typically does what? It sets the other person probably back on their heels and makes them start to feel a little bit defensive. So have some examples at the ready, and you might identify the items or item, if it's a short list, then have those at the ready too. The most high priority, most kind of, broad enough descriptions that you can convey to the other person without trying to activate them, but not so broad that it becomes unclear. And that's a real tightrope to walk, but try to find that balance. Stick primarily to the facts. Emotions are important too. You can share how things made you feel. That's okay. But I would say sprinkle those in sparingly. If you're going to try to engage with somebody, try to stick primarily to the more objective third-party view of these things and enter into the more emotional part of things a little bit more sparingly. In terms of how you set this up with somebody, well, sometimes you're just going to find yourself in conflict with somebody. It erupts during a meeting or a chance encounter in the hallway. You just find yourself in it, and that's going to happen. But if this is something that's been simmering or it's been on your mind for a while, and you're trying to maybe move things in a better direction, you might start by asking somebody, hey, do you have a few minutes to talk sometime? And if you do that, you might say something, it's hard to script this, but so much. You might say, look, I'd like to get your perspective on something, or something's bothering me. I think it might be helpful for us to talk about it. Your tone, the nonverbal, your timing, all going to be incredibly important. If you see that the individual with whom you're having conflict is in a heightened emotional state and they're dashing here and there, right? This is again assuming that you have time to plan for a dialogue, maybe for something that's been simmering or on your mind for a while. And pick and choose your moments. Pick also a time and a space that feels safe for you and for the other individual. So maybe try to avoid calling somebody to your office or going to somebody else's office. Things like walking meetings in more of a discrete location, or sitting down for coffee together. These are very basic approaches that just serve to start to normalize things and reduce some of the tension. So you're de-escalating things if at all possible. Entering into dialogue, identify the issue or concern, and also be very upfront about what you hope to happen as a result of trying to dialogue about this something together. I was hoping we might have X, Y, and Z happen. I'd love to hear from you. You're trying to reach some kind of mutually beneficial outcome, knowing that that might not always be possible. Sometimes it's just more a matter of, at least I'm trying to build understanding, to build respect, to build some kind of connection with somebody else, or to repair it. Whatever it is, you're trying to move it in a direction that's better than what it is at the present moment. So some thoughts entering into dialogue with someone. With communication, somebody has to go first. So if you're both sitting there politely saying, well, you, I mean, if at all possible, if you're the person who's initiating this, it might be nice for you to say, look, I would love to hear from you first, right? But if somebody offers it to you, that's up to you if you want to take advantage of that. Either way, whoever goes first, right? There's a listener and a speaker. For the listener, the aim is to understand before being understood, right? We're talking about active listening. You're focusing your energy on the speaker. Now, there are mindful listening exercises that you can do. You can build this capacity. Our natural inclination is to jump in, to want to say our piece because we're a little bit worried about forgetting what was on our mind or wanting to maybe push back on something that was shared. And this is a capacity that we can build to sit quietly and to allow somebody else to share their thoughts. It doesn't mean that your silence means you agree with them, but you're not waiting to jump in with your insight or the thing that you want to, push back on. It's really trying to listen actively and to demonstrate to them that you're doing this in a good faith effort to try to listen, to try to learn, and to try to uncover what's going on for the person, right? So I talked earlier about what are their needs, what are their wants, what might feel threatening for them. The more you can dig around here, the more time you can invest in trying to understand the position of somebody else in conflict, the greater the likelihood of you actually being able to do something with that information. The more you could learn, the better. It doesn't mean you won't have your moment to share your own thoughts and experience, which is also extremely important. But your starting point is, let me see if I could figure out what might, and that's the key word, what might be going on for the other person. So entering it into it with humility. And because it's something that's a might, you could rely on those big three in helping professions of paraphrasing, reflecting, and reframing. And essentially, these are tools that are utilized where you're checking in with the other person and saying, hey, did I get that right? Is this what you're trying to say? Please let me know if I've heard you correctly. If I've got something wrong, let me know as well. If you're trying to reframe or reflect, you're basically trying to take some of the heat out of what a person's sharing with you. So if somebody comes to me and says, my supervisor acts like a real jerk towards me. They're always on my back. They're always trying to boss me around and tell me what to do, right? There's a lot of emotional energy that's there. There's a lot of emotion present. I might not repeat that back word for word, but I might say it sounds like you feel like you need a little bit of space from the supervision that's being offered to you. It sounds like that's not the way that feels most comfortable to you, right? So it's finding a way to take some of the bite out of it, but also trying to reflect back to the person that you think you heard them, right? With humility and checking in, is that right? Did I get that right? Or, what else could you share with me? Paraphrasing, reflecting, and reframing at their worst can feel very robotic and very wooden, and in some cases make the other party feel maybe even a little bit more agitated because it just feels like you're going through this checklist, and that's not it. So I mentioned earlier, genuine. So not just trying to, get through a conversation, not sitting there with your arms crossed, being aware of nonverbals, being as open as you possibly can to say, I'd really like to try to understand, is this right? Am I hearing you correctly? Exploratory phrases, here are a couple of ones that you could use. I'm not going to read through every one of these, but I'll just sit quietly for a moment to rest my voice, and this way you don't have to hear me kind of ramble on, and you could look at these on your own and maybe take some notes if you feel that would be helpful, or take a picture of the slide, or whatever seems most supportive for you. Basically, we're trying to build understanding, we're trying to explore, we're trying to check in with the other party or parties. Clarifying, I've said a few words about that already, but again, some different ways that you might do that. When it's your turn to communicate, you probably heard this one as well also, but start with I statements, right? So you statements tend to make a person feel a little bit more on the defensive. You did this, you did that. And it's a subtle shift, but using an I statement to start off, I feel X when Y happened because, of this, and I'd like filling in all of those different spaces in this template can be received in a different way oftentimes by the listener, right? Remember what I shared earlier about, being clear on your intentions and your goals, because whatever you share, whatever you do, whatever you say needs to flow in support of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish to make things better than wherever they are at the starting point, right? Better than where they are in the less productive version of what's going on, right? So as you're sharing, you can also, the other person might extend to you that same invitation that you extended to them. Okay, they'll circle back and they'll loop back in and say, okay, what I think I hear you saying is X, Y, and Z. Is that right? They may or may not do that. What you can do is check in with them every now and again and say, do you have any questions? So I know I'm giving you a lot of information right now. Do you have any questions about any of this? How are you feeling about all of this? What are your thoughts? Now, this becomes more of a dialogue. And again, it's impossible for us to really script this, but so much. But the idea is the same. If you're in conflict, you're trying to listen and learn, right? And then you're trying to share your thoughts and build that understanding, right? So what happens next, right? There is a dialogue that needs to take place. You need to keep the dialogue going. And if you're going in it with that genuine, sincere intention of trying to listen and learn, this doesn't become a contest. This isn't about who gets to win, who gets to lose, right? It's a chance for you both to try to sort things out. On those earliest slides that I shared, there was the constructive version of conflict resolution or conflict, and that included things like a lesson, right? A dance, an opportunity to learn and grow and maybe even bring us closer together. If that's really what you're going for, and I would suggest that probably should be what you are going for, then it doesn't become a contest. It's an opportunity to try to problem solve together, to generate options to address whatever struggles you're, having together. In that definition of conflict that I offered very early on, it was that interdependence, right? Shared resources, difference on task, that interference, right? Those kinds of things. So you're trying to address whatever the concern is. Is it about task? Is it about personality? Is it about communication? What is it about? What can we do with the problem? Not with the person. What can we do with the problem? Right? And sometimes it's the person part of it might be things like how you communicate or what you say or how you say it, those types of things. So the person's not entirely left out of it. But what is the problem? What is the content, right? Where do we go? What needs to happen? What can we do? Being very clear on goals, right? And then becomes the process of evaluating. Now, for those of you who have an ombuds at your institution, this is a really beneficial service that an ombuds can provide to help you generate possibilities, to generate options, and then to assess them, right? What seems like it's, got pros and cons attached to it. How do you evaluate those, right? But as you engage with someone else in this, note the most promising ideas, weigh pros and cons. Negotiation is very much a part of the process too. Nobody gets to be the person who calls the shots. Now, with that said, it's not lost on me that sometimes we are going to be in conflict with somebody, and there is a hierarchical system that exists. So let's say it's supervisee, supervisor, or student and instructor, and that's a very real dynamic, right? Where the person who is in the lower part of that power relationship might feel like they don't necessarily have, much grounding to be able to negotiate. That can be a very real thing. What I can offer there is to do your best to try to work within the parameters that are available to you. But yes, there are going to be times where someone's going to say, I don't want to negotiate, I won't. And that's going to be a tough spot to arrive at. And you'll have more decisions to kind of make or more assessments to make if you arrive at that point, but you do the best that you can. A lot of times when people are in conflict with each other, there's this desire to try to move through it as quickly as possible, to try to sort it out and resolve it. And I trust that often comes from a very good place, right? But sometimes in that desire to get everything sorted out, where there's like just a lot of pressure, like we have to keep talking, and it's okay to take breaks. It's okay to walk away. It's okay to engage with somebody else. So utilizing a third-party neutral, such as an ombuds, can be extremely effective. If you don't have an ombuds at your institution, and you'd ever like to dialogue with me, I'd be very happy to dialogue with you about what it's like to establish an ombuds office at an institution and what the value added would be for a position at an institution for the wellness and the health of the individuals and the organization. So if you have one, make use of it. If not, you might find somebody else who's a trusted third party at your campus. After you've dialogued with each other and you've come up with some kind of plan, following up and monitoring progress is going to be very important. Sometimes a plan is put in place and then, people walk away from it, and sometimes things move in a good direction and other times they don't. And revisiting is important. Checking in with each other at regular intervals can be important. So if you have a plan in place, look, this hasn't been going well. What can we do about it? Here are some possibilities. Let's take these things as food for thought. Let's weigh pros and cons. What are you willing to do? What am I willing to do? How do we want to do better than what's going on right now? All right, do you want to try X, Y, and Z? Great, we'll try those things. How about we check in with each other next week and just see how things are going? Why don't we check in with each other a week after that? Whatever it is, just following up with each other so it's not just kind of floating out into the ether. Sometimes in our discomfort or in our rush to try to make things better, we come up with a plan and then we keep fingers crossed and hope things move in a good direction. And sometimes things do, and sometimes they don't. So building in some kind of follow-up time can be helpful. You may be surprised, or you may not be surprised, at how often when we're in conflict with each other, one of the things that the other party wants, or one of the things that we need, is simply an apology. So when I'm going over with an individual what looks better than, right now, and what would you like to have happen? What are some possible outcomes that would feel better for you? Many times, what an individual will tell me is, I just want the other person to acknowledge that what they did wasn't okay. I want them to apologize to me. I didn't like the way they treated me. They treated me unfairly, right? They treated me disrespectfully. These are hot buttons that I mentioned during the social psychology part of this afternoon's webinar, right? So apologies can be very powerful, as can the counterpart, right? The flip side of that, forgiveness. So apologies and forgiveness can sometimes just be the thing that unlocks this logjam that we're experiencing. We're stuck in conflict. And that takes a lot of vulnerability, right? That takes a lot of trust. And yet again, it's not lost on me that when in conflict, sometimes one of the things that's contributed to the emergence of conflict is this lack, or full lack of, or less amount of trust that exists in the relationship. And my goodness, there's so much to be said about trust and how one builds and maintains and repairs trust. And if you'd ever like to dialogue with me about that, I'd be happy to share whatever thoughts I can on that, because that is very central to a lot of conflict as well. But that is its own huge area to address. But apologies, forgiveness, if the trust exists enough where you could get to that point, if that's what's called for, those can be very powerful things. Pitfalls to avoid. Now, I've touched on some of these as we've gone along, but let me just kind of recap. Overscripting. So, if you're about to enter into a situation, a dialogue with somebody about something that has been existing for a while, by all means, pull together notes, be thoughtful about it, having that level of clarity, having those examples can be really helpful, but try not to overscript it so it doesn't become so stiff that the sincerity and the genuineness doesn't come through. Predicting, oftentimes when in conflict, we get the sense that I know what's going to happen here. I know how the person's going to react. And sometimes it's based on the track record that we have from the person. So there's good reason to suspect that this might not be a very productive, kind of experience. But leave space as best you can to allow that this might be a different way, utilizing some of these strategies, right? This might be a different experience. It might not, but you do what you can, right? Reaction mode. I have shared trying to move away from reacting and instead moving towards thoughtfully responding. So with that in mind, in the spirit of that, we're going to try to avoid rushing through the process, jumping to conclusions, right? Rushing to judgment, getting caught up in that emotional energy of the other person. Stay in that thinking part of your brain. Try to keep the other person as best as possible in the thinking part of their brain by utilizing some of these strategies and techniques. Remember that threat response. We're trying to not get activated. We're trying to not activate the other person, because if we're going to try to productively work through this, we have to keep this part of the brain online, right? And a lot of times we move ahead to trying to problem solve. And if the alarm bells are going off, you're probably going to make very little, if any, headway, because that needs to subside before this comes back online and we can actually start more productively dialoguing. So keep those things in mind. To help keep those alarm bells from being set off, try to avoid unproductive language. So insults, sarcasm, blaming, using statements like always and never, right? So, many times, most times, sometimes can be better than always and never, right? Even if that is your experience of it, that it's always and never, those typically make things just feel a little bit more stuck. It doesn't allow much opportunity, for you or the other person to consider that something else can happen. So leave a little room for that. Losing focus, so not listening, or when you just jump in, that can be a real problem. That's a breakdown in communication that could occur. in conflict, right? So if you're going to engage with others, try to genuinely stay in that listening and learning part of your brain as much as possible. Also, prematurely moving to problem solving, we've talked about quite a bit. And then, getting uncomfortable with it. So changing the subjects, making jokes, somehow just trying to get out of doing the hard work of dialoguing about whatever the source of conflict is. And again, there can be many. So my goodness, that's a lot of ground that we've covered, and I appreciate you sitting and listening as I've shared some thoughts on this. I have some case study to offer just based on the time that we have left, though. I really would be much more curious, instead of moving forward with case studies, just hearing from you. So Tamika, I would be very grateful if maybe you could help me, maybe share some things that have come forward in Q&A or things that have come up for folks, or somehow facilitate so that we can engage with this a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'll start with the very first question that we have in queue. Workplace conflict is a real thing, but in my opinion, the presence of conflict is not the issue. It is how we respond to it and seek resolution. How can one best display a threat response that is not perceived as one being overly emotional, especially as a woman?
Such a good question. Yeah, and perhaps since this came in early, perhaps some of the things that I shared may have addressed this already, but I would say, to the extent possible, you're going to take care of the things that are in your control. So, just how you choose to show up, that process of settling yourself down, right? And just checking in with yourself, catching your breath, being thoughtful about your intentions and being thoughtful about your use of words, your nonverbal, that genuine interest that, I mentioned, conveying to others that sense of empathy and understanding and offering them that sense of common humanity. Those are all things that you can bring to the equation that might make the person more receptive. There's no guarantee. You can do your part, right? And so however you're showing up in the conversation, part of the way that I've described it with individuals is, casual and conversational, almost nonchalant, right? And so rather than engage with this position of, trying to dominate the other person, and you're using volume and language and just all these different things that make it clear that you're bringing this emotional heat and energy and frustration, that's probably not going to be the most productive way of doing it. But also entering into it with kind of hat in hand and, less than is probably not going to be in your best interest either. So keeping on that level playing field, like really trying to settle yourself, trying to ground into it. And part of that is reminding yourself that you have a right to discuss this, right? Really sitting into that and saying, you know what, it's okay. It might be uncomfortable and the other person might not want to hear this, but it's within my rights. It's okay. It's okay to have these conversations. It's okay to make an attempt to try to dialogue with somebody. And if you can get yourself in that mental headspace and really feel into that, it might make for a little bit of a different experience.
Thank you, Dr. Newsell. Second question, how do we handle facial expressions if the other person is still talking and we are trying to keep from speaking or responding with our emotions involved?
Yeah, and maybe Tamika, I don't know if you have any clues on this, maybe from what you just read. As I'm hearing it, are we talking about our own facial expressions, or we're kind of trying to keep ourselves in the thinking part of our brain in response to others' facial expressions?
Yes, the latter.
The latter, how to keep, so if someone else is having a reaction to us, yeah, so how do we do that? I would say that keep the focus on your side of the equation, right? It's going to be very normal, right? Our minds are wired to be attentive to possible threats in the environment. And so I'm thinking like the first place that my mind went is the negativity bias, right? That idea that if we're picking up on these cues from other people that something isn't, or another individual, that something isn't okay, that it starts to make us start to really focus on that and zone in on it. And so if the other person is kind of frowning or shaking their head or demonstrating something that shows that they're maybe not quite as receptive, or they're not quite in that space that we'd hope them to be, it's going to be a lot of work, but you catch your breath and try to stay in the thinking part of your brain. And when you get that proper pause, it's hard to describe it, but you look for your opportunity to say, hey, do you mind if I jump in here for a second? Right? I'm just going to catch my breath for a second. Do you mind if I just jump in for a second? It's okay, but it seems to me like you might be having a reaction to some of what I'm sharing, right? I might be wrong here, so please, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm picking up on something that's going on where, it seems like you might be frowning, or I noticed you were shaking your head. Is there something you can share with me in words what might be behind that, right? And it's not a confrontation, it's not an apology, it's an exploration, right? It's that genuine curiosity. And so really getting yourself into that space where you're saying, it's just you and me, and we're just trying to sort this out. Like, what's going on for you? Can you help me understand this? That could possibly be some strategies that could be effective.
And on the flip side to that, Dr. Nussel, how do we handle our nonverbal expressions as well?
That's a great one.
That?
Yeah, and it's funny. So I'll share with you that, when I get deep in thought, I notice that I furrow my brow a lot. Like, and it's just me concentrating. But somebody could very easily interpret that as like, I'm displeased in some way, or, frowning. And so, I could share even from my own experience that if at all possible, if you've received, let me backtrack a little bit. If you've ever received feedback from somebody about your nonverbals, that's a good starting point. If you haven't received feedback about your nonverbals when you're in, conflict with somebody or a disagreement with somebody, right? You might ask somebody who's trusted and say, hey, look, I just have to check in with you. You've had disagreements with me in the past. How does that manifest itself in my physical, being? What have you picked up on? What could you offer me? And somebody might say, oh, you know what, Jerry, what you do is, you lean forward in your chair, your arms start to cross. It's almost like a tell for you, or X, Y, and Z happen. So you can see if you can find somebody who could safely offer you some feedback so you can become a little bit more aware of how these things show up for you in the nonverbal categories. I think those could be really good starting points. Another technique you could use is if you have the luxury of being able to prepare for a difficult conversation or to dialogue about a conflict, right? It's not something you just find yourself in the moment. If you have the luxury of preparing for it, what you might do is plop yourself down in front of a mirror, right? And kind of mentally rehearse a little bit and see what comes up for you, right? And it's not meant to do it with any kind of judgment, like it's right or wrong that your eyebrows furrow, or that you lean forward, or that you cross your arms. But you might just want to check in with yourself and say, interesting, that's what happens for me. I wonder, do I want to play with that a little bit? Do I want to see what it's like for me and how it might be received differently by the other person if I play around with it and try to intentionally, you don't want to distract yourself, but intentionally kind of maybe keep my eyes a little bit more wide open, or maybe practice leaning back, or maybe practice keeping my hands in more of kind of an open palm position, or on the arms of my chair, or what have you. So you can play around with it a little bit, but there's only so much you can do. I think clearly, like if you were sitting there, like really, actively frowning, and glaring at somebody, those are things you want to try to avoid. But there's a lot of space also to say that we're going to show up and we're going to respond in different ways. It's going to manifest itself in different ways, and you do the best you can. The checking in part is going to be really important, right? So there's some thoughts on that.
How do you handle conflict in the workplace when communication seems impossible?
Yeah. So my first response to that is, really look at that word impossible, because if something really feels impossible, it doesn't give a lot of space for the opportunity for something at least even a little bit better. And I don't want to get caught up in the semantics of it, but there's the impossible, like that's a starting point. Like, is it really, really impossible? And it might be close to impossible, but hey, let's allow just a little space for something better. If you really think something's impossible and there's no reason to try to engage with it, and if you're going to engage with it, then it would be of service to yourself and the other person to say, we might have at least a little bit of a shot of this, even if my gut feeling tells me, I don't think so. So stepping back and checking in with yourself, right? It's not to go in, naive, or just kind of like, oh yeah, this is going to be easier. I'm just going to walk through this, and now I've got these strategies and steps, and this is going to be great. It's going to be work, right? Conflict resolution, difficult conversations, they're difficult, right? It takes work. And so being very honest with yourself and saying, it might not be my favorite thing. This might take a lot of work, but even the phrasing of it like that and moving it away from impossibility can be very helpful. And then when you leave yourself that little space, you say, so what would that actually look like? So what would better communication between us look like? What might I have to share with the other person? What might I be able to learn from the other person? Because they have a perspective in this also, right? So I think that'd be kind of a starting point. And then doing the best you can. None of this is a guarantee. You're trying to nudge things towards the likelihood of a better outcome, knowing it's not a guarantee, but you got to kind of press for that.
What do you mean by mirroring emotional outburst?
Yeah, so emotion contagion, right? So when other people start to get emotionally heated, it's very natural for us to kind of like catch that, right? So when we're entering into a space and let's say we're trying to be calm and we're trying to get other people to mirror our calm, right? To mirror our, sense of look, genuine sincerity and trying to want to dialogue and be curious and the sorts of things we've been talking about over this last hour or so, right? But the opposite can happen also. We could share that sense of calm and that sense of respect and that sense of understanding, but either we or the other person can start to get that emotional energy up. When that emotional energy goes up, your activation sometimes activates me, right? And so if the other person starts to get heated and they start to talk faster, then there's the temptation for us to also talk faster and us to talk louder, and we're kind of catching our breath. And so you don't want to kind of get caught up in mirroring that. And so maybe to clarify a little bit, the mirroring isn't an intentional thing. Like, we're going to mimic the other person. But what we might do is kind of just be aware of, am I getting caught up in what I'm picking up from the other person, in the non-productive sense of things. Now we can try to offer something that they may be able to kind of pick up on also. So if somebody's coming to the conversation and approaching you with all this energy and heat, the pace of the language gets, louder and faster and everything, you can say, hey, look, it might be helpful. Can we catch our breath here for a second? Right. So you're modeling it, but you're also then changing your tone and trying to maybe offer to them a style of communicating that maybe they can kind of mirror a little bit. So it's subtle. It's not necessarily always calling it out or trying to mimic somebody else, but it's being aware of these things and trying to offer more productive ways as or if possible.
Absolutely. We have one final question in queue. It sounds like we are really catering to the other person to make them feel comfortable. Is that the goal or part of the goal or necessary?
Yeah, I love it. That's part of it, right? So what's in service to the other person is of service to you insofar as you're not trying to create a dynamic where the other person's needs are greater than or less than your own, right? You both have an experience. There's something each of you has to share. But if you're going to be able to dialogue, right, somebody has to start, right? And if the other person is willing to take the lead and say, look, I would love to understand you, like you come across that person, maybe they're part of this webinar also, and both of you are offering to each other, no, you go first. I really want to hear from you. Let me try to learn, let me try to understand genuinely. Then the other person, you might say, okay, I'll take you up on your offer. Here's where I'm at. And you go from there. And then you give time to the other person. So the turn taking isn't about somebody being more or less important. It's about having a starting point because you can't both share your experiences at the same time. But if you're going to make the attempt and you're the one in control, right? This is a locus of control thing very much. If the locus of control resides with you because, you have control over your own actions, you don't have control over the other person's, then what you can do is to try to set the tone, to try to set the table, to try to engage in, or utilize these strategies to make things better. And so that means starting with, settling the other person down, keeping them in the thinking part of the brain, right? Keeping yourself in the thinking part of your brain. This is all in service to both of you, right? It's not about somebody winning or losing. It's not about somebody gets to do something and somebody else doesn't. You're not deferring your experience or, the things that are important to you. You're simply trying to, strategically, wisely, amicably, try to engage with the other person first so that you can then have your chance to share and learn and dialogue and try to sort things out, right? So it's just a starting point. It doesn't negate or lessen your own experience. That definitely has to still be part of the equation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Newsell, for that information and an insightful discussion this morning. Very, very well appreciated. Thank you for helping us with the strategies, tips, and tools on how we can navigate beyond conflict in a way that is very meaningful, respectful, and safe. So now I'll turn it over to Mara DeCola.
I'll reiterate that. Thank you so much, Jerry. This was fantastic. I think there was a lot of really important information that you shared, that someone had commented that it'll help them in both their personal and professional life. And I agree. I think it was such a fantastic session. Thank you everyone for attending with us today. We are always grateful to have you with us for these professional development sessions. I do want to share, we have one more session for the fall semester coming up. I think you can all see my screen. Gift Yourself with Activity is coming up on December the 11th at 3:30 p.m. It's a virtual session. And so you'll be able to register if you have not gotten the CRC newsletter. It is in the newsletter. And then you can also find it on our website. So we hope to see you all on December 11th at 3:30 with Gift Yourself with Activity.
Wonderful. And thank you all for being here. Tamika and Maura, thank you so much for the kind words. If I could be
you.
of service to anyone, please feel free to reach out, and certainly wish you the best.